August 9th, 1945, Manchuria. The frozen soil beneath Lieutenant Kenji Nakamura's boots crunched with each step as he walked toward his Mitsubishi A6M0. Dawn had not yet broken over the airfield at Harbin, and the pre-flight air carried the metallic bite of approaching winter. Around him, ground crews moved like shadows between the aircraft, their breath forming small clouds that dissipated quickly in the crisp morning atmosphere. The war had changed. Even here, thousands of kilometers from the home islands, Nakamura could sense it in the way his fellow pilots moved. Slower, more deliberate, as if each mission might be their last. The fuel shortages had worsened. Replacement parts arrived sporadically. Most troubling of all, reliable intelligence about enemy movements had become increasingly scarce. If you're interested in untold stories from the final days of World War II, consider subscribing for more historical accounts that shaped our world. Nakamura adjusted his leather flight jacket and examined the morning's mission briefing once more. Soviet forces had been massing along the border for weeks, but Japanese command insisted these were merely defensive preparations. The Kwantung Army maintained its positions across Manchuria, confident in the natural barriers and fortified lines that had protected the region since 1931. Yet something felt different about this particular morning, an electricity in the air that had nothing to do with the approaching storm clouds. The sound of aircraft engines warming up began to fill the airfield. Nakamura's mechanic, Sergeant Watanabe, approached with the final pre-flight checklist. Watanabe had been servicing aircraft for 15 years, and his weathered hands moved with practiced efficiency as he checked the Zero's control surfaces one final time. The sergeant's usually steady demeanor seemed strained, though he said nothing about the rumors circulating among the ground crews. Whispers of massive Soviet tank columns moving south through the forests. As Nakamura climbed into his cockpit, he noticed the familiar weight of his flight helmet settling over his ears. The leather interior had molded to his head over countless missions, and the radio headset crackled with static as ground control began the morning communications check. Through his canopy, he could see the other pilots of his squadron preparing their aircraft with the same methodical precision that had become second nature after years of combat. The mission orders were straightforward. Reconnaissance patrol along the northern border sectors, with particular attention to any unusual Soviet activity near the rail lines. Intelligence suggested the enemy was conducting routine training exercises, nothing more. Nakamura had flown similar patrols dozens of times throughout the summer, always returning with reports of minimal enemy presence and standard defensive positions. But as his engine reached optimal temperature and the propeller settled into its familiar rhythm, Nakamura found himself thinking about his younger brother Hiroshi, stationed with an infantry unit near Changchun. Their last exchange of letters had been 3 weeks ago, when Hiroshi mentioned increased Soviet artillery fire during the night hours. Nothing sustained, just harassment intended to keep the Japanese troops on edge. Still, the pattern troubled Nakamura more than he cared to admit. The other aircraft in his formation were now ready for takeoff. Captain Tanaka, the squadron leader, signaled from his cockpit with a raised hand. Tanaka had been flying combat missions since 1942 and possessed an instinct for danger that had kept him alive through the worst phases of the Pacific War. If anyone could read the subtle signs of impending action, it would be Tanaka. As the Zeros lined up for departure, Nakamura performed his final instrument checks with mechanical precision. Oil pressure normal, fuel quantity adequate for a 4-hour patrol, radio functioning properly, control surfaces responding correctly. Everything appeared ready for what should be another routine surveillance mission over territory that Japan had controlled for more than a decade. The first aircraft lifted off into the gray morning sky, followed by the second and third. When Nakamura's turn came, he advanced the throttle and felt his Zero accelerate down the runway. The familiar sensation of liftoff brought a momentary sense of relief. Whatever uncertainties awaited on the ground, at least in the air he maintained some control over his fate. Climbing to patrol altitude, the squadron formed up in loose formation, and headed north toward the border regions. Below them, the Manchurian landscape spread out in endless patterns of forest and grassland, broken occasionally by rivers and the straight lines of railway tracks. From this height, the territory looked peaceful, almost pastoral. There was no visible evidence of the massive military forces that supposedly controlled every strategic position. As they approached the designated patrol area, Captain Tanaka's voice came through the radio headset, calm and professional as always. The squadron would split into two elements for better coverage of the assigned sectors. Nakamura would lead the second element, consisting of 3 aircraft, while Tanaka took the remaining 4 planes to sweep the eastern approaches. The morning sun had finally broken through the cloud cover, casting long shadows across the landscape below. Nakamura found himself scanning not just for enemy aircraft or unusual ground activity, but for any sign that this day would be different from all the others. Something in the quality of the light, perhaps, or the way the wind patterns seemed to shift more frequently than usual. His wingman, Lieutenant Sato, maintained perfect position off his starboard wing. Sato was barely 20 years old, with fewer than 50 combat hours in his logbook, but he flew with the natural instincts that couldn't be taught in training school. Behind them, Sergeant Yamada piloted the third Zero with the steady competence that came from years of experience as an enlisted pilot. As they crossed into the border zone, Nakamura began the systematic visual search that had become routine during these patrols. Railway junctions first, then major road intersections, followed by any structures or clearings that might indicate military activity. The morning remained quiet, with only scattered clouds drifting across an otherwise clear sky. Then Sato's voice cut through the radio static, sharp with surprise. "Contact bearing 030, low altitude, multiple aircraft approaching fast." Nakamura immediately turned his attention to the indicated direction and felt his pulse quicken. Rising from the northern horizon came a formation of aircraft unlike anything he had encountered during months of border patrols. These were not the lumbering transport planes or obsolescent fighters that occasionally appeared in Soviet airspace. These machines climbed with aggressive speed and purpose, their sleek profiles cutting through the morning air with unmistakable intent. Lieutenant Colonel Dmitry Volkov pressed his gloved palm against the frosted glass of the operations bunker, watching Soviet ground crews wheel the Yak-9 fighters into position across the frozen airfield. The metallic tang of aviation fuel mixed with the bite of Siberian wind through gaps in the concrete walls. Each aircraft bore fresh red stars painted over hastily applied winter camouflage, their engines still warm from pre-flight checks. Intelligence reports scattered across the wooden table behind him detailed Japanese fighter formations, massing near the Manchurian border. The enemy had grown bold, their Kai-43 Hayabusa fighters probing deeper into Soviet airspace each day. Volkov traced a finger along the reconnaissance photographs, showing Japanese positions, neat rows of aircraft at Harbin, pilots in pressed uniforms standing beside their machines with characteristic precision. Captain Alexei Petrov entered the bunker, snow melting from his fur collar onto the concrete floor. His weathered hands carried a leather satchel containing the morning's intercepts. Radio operators had captured fragments of Japanese transmissions, their voices crackling through static with an urgency that suggested something larger than routine patrols. The documents revealed deployment schedules for 3 Japanese squadrons, each equipped with the latest interceptor variants. Petrov spread the papers across worn maps of Manchuria, his index finger marking airbases where enemy strength concentrated. The Japanese had positioned their forces with methodical care, creating overlapping patrol zones that protected vital supply lines running south from Harbin. Volkov studied the tactical situation with growing concern. Japanese pilots had earned reputations for aggressive tactics and exceptional marksmanship, their training emphasizing precision over raw firepower. Soviet intelligence estimated their average pilot possessed over 200 combat hours, veterans seasoned by years of fighting in China and the Pacific Theater. Mechanics outside worked with practiced efficiency, loading ammunition belts into wing-mounted cannons while fuel trucks topped off wing tanks. The Yak-9 represented Soviet engineering at its finest, a fighter optimized for high-altitude combat with speed advantages over most enemy aircraft. Yet numbers alone would not determine the outcome of aerial engagements over the contested borderlands. Petrov pulled out a photograph captured during the previous week's reconnaissance mission. The image showed Japanese pilots gathered around their squadron commander, faces visible beneath leather flight helmets. Their expressions carried the confidence of experienced airmen, men accustomed to dominating the skies over their assigned sectors. Teletype machines in the communications center chattered with updates from forward observation posts. Border guards reported increased Japanese air activity, with formations of 4 to 6 aircraft conducting systematic sweeps along the frontier. The enemy appeared to be testing Soviet response times, probing for weaknesses in defensive arrangements. Volkov examined weather forecasts, predicting clear skies over Manchuria for the next 48 hours. Ideal flying conditions would favor whoever struck first, giving attackers maximum visibility and maneuverability. The Japanese had consistently demonstrated their preference for dawn operations, using the rising sun to mask their approach vectors. Soviet radar stations tracked multiple contacts approaching from the southeast, their signatures consistent with Japanese fighter formations. The electronic pulses painted glowing dots across cathode ray screens, each representing aircraft closing at high speed toward the border. Operators called out bearing and distance updates while plotters marked positions on horizontal displays. Communications officers relayed scramble orders to waiting pilots, their voices cutting through the mechanical noise of warming engines. Soviet airmen ran toward their aircraft with practiced urgency, parachutes bouncing against their backs as they crossed the frozen tarmac. Ground crews pulled wheel chocks while mechanics made final inspections of control surfaces and weapon systems. The first Yak-9 lifted off into gray morning light, its engine note shifting from idle rumble to climbing whine as the pilot advanced throttles. Additional fighters followed in rapid succession, their wheels retracting into wing wells as they gained altitude above snow-covered forests, stretching toward the Manchurian horizon. Japanese formations maintained steady courses toward the border, unaware that Soviet interceptors were already climbing to meet them. The morning's engagement would test both sides' tactical doctrine, pilot skill, and equipment performance under combat conditions. Radio frequencies crackled with positioning reports as opposing forces converged over the disputed territory, setting the stage for an aerial confrontation that would reshape both sides' understanding of air superiority in the region. The metallic tang of aviation fuel mixed with engine oil filled Lieutenant Yamashita's nostrils as he adjusted his oxygen mask in the cramped cockpit of his Ki-43 Hayabusa. February 18, 1945, brought bitter winds across the frozen landscape of Manchuria, where crystalline frost accumulated on his canopy, despite the heated cabin. The familiar weight of his flight suit pressed against his shoulders as he watched ground crews complete final checks on the aircraft lined up along the improvised airstrip carved from the hard-packed snow. At 23, Yamashita commanded a section of 12 fighters stationed at Mukden Airfield, where the diminishing fuel supplies and replacement parts had become daily concerns for every pilot in the 244th Sentai. His weathered flight log recorded 47 combat missions over Chinese territories, but recent intelligence reports spoke of new aircraft operating from Soviet bases across the border, machines with performance characteristics that challenged everything the Imperial Japanese Army Air Force believed about their air superiority in the region. The briefing tent retained traces of tobacco smoke from the morning's operational planning session. Major Tanaka had spread reconnaissance photographs across the wooden table, pointing to grainy images of aircraft silhouettes captured by forward observers near the Amur River. The unknown fighters displayed distinctive features: inline engines, retractable landing gear, and a profile that matched no American or Chinese aircraft in their identification manuals. Soviet markings were clearly visible on the wings and fuselage, confirming the involvement of Red Army Air Force units that had remained officially neutral in the Pacific theater until recent months. Yamashita's squadron received orders to conduct armed reconnaissance along the Manchurian border, with specific instructions to identify and engage any hostile aircraft encountered. The mission parameters emphasize the strategic importance of maintaining Japanese air control over the industrial centers of Harbin and Changchun, where military production facilities continued operating despite increasing pressure from multiple fronts. His pilots, most barely 20 years old with minimal combat experience, listened intently as he outlined formation procedures and engagement tactics developed through months of aerial combat against numerically superior opponents. The distinctive whistle of aircraft engines warming up echoed across the airfield as maintenance personnel removed wheel chocks and disconnected electrical ground power units. Yamashita's Hayabusa shuddered as the Nakajima Ha-115 radial engine reached operating temperature, its 14 cylinders producing the familiar rhythmic vibration that transmitted through the airframe and into his body. Radio checks confirmed clear communications with his wingmen, while tower personnel reported favorable weather conditions despite scattered snow showers predicted for the afternoon. Takeoff procedures proceeded according to established protocols, with each aircraft lifting off at 30-second intervals to maintain proper formation spacing. The frozen terrain below revealed the geometric patterns of abandoned agricultural fields, interspersed with the dark lines of railway tracks that connected scattered villages to the major transportation hubs. Yamashita adjusted his course, heading to follow the planned route toward the border region, where Soviet forces had reportedly established forward operating bases within striking distance of Japanese positions. As the formation climbed to cruising altitude, radio intercepts began detecting unfamiliar call signs and frequency patterns that suggested increased enemy air activity in the target area. The intelligence briefings had mentioned reports from German technical advisors who described advanced Soviet fighter designs incorporating lessons learned from European combat experience. These aircraft allegedly combined high-altitude performance with exceptional maneuverability, capabilities that could neutralize the tactical advantages Japanese pilots had exploited against earlier opponent types. The border region appeared desolate from 10,000 feet, with vast expanses of snow-covered forest, broken by frozen rivers and occasional settlements marked by thin columns of smoke rising from chimneys. Navigation checkpoints confirmed their position relative to known landmarks, while fuel consumption calculations indicated sufficient reserves for the planned mission duration plus emergency allowances. Yamashita's radio crackled with position reports from his section leaders, confirming all aircraft remained operational and maintained proper formation discipline. Suddenly, his number 3 pilot transmitted a sighting report, multiple aircraft approaching from the northwest at approximately the same altitude. The unknown formation consisted of single-engine fighters displaying the distinctive red stars of Soviet markings, flying in a loose tactical spread that demonstrated professional competence. Yamashita immediately ordered his pilots to assume combat formation while attempting visual identification of the enemy aircraft types through his binoculars. The approaching Soviet fighters exhibited sleek, streamlined profiles with liquid-cooled engines and retractable landing gear that marked them as significantly more advanced than the crude aircraft typically encountered in this theater. Their formation leader executed a climbing turn that revealed exceptional climb rate and maneuverability characteristics far superior to intelligence estimates. These machines, later identified as WWII Yak-9 fighters, represented the latest generation of Soviet aviation technology, equipped with powerful engines and heavy armament that could challenge the most experienced Japanese pilots. The metallic tang of aviation fuel clung to Lieutenant Alexei Voronkov's flight suit as he walked across the frozen tarmac at Mudanjiang Airfield. January 1945. Manchuria's bitter wind cut through the gaps between aircraft hangars, carrying with it the distant rumble of Soviet Il-2 Sturmovix returning from their morning sorties. Snow crystals stung his exposed cheeks as he approached his Yak-9U, its olive-green fuselage bearing fresh battle scars from yesterday's encounter with Japanese Ki-84 fighters. Voronkov ran his gloved fingers along the aircraft's wing, feeling the small punctures where 20mm rounds had found their mark. His ground crew chief, Senior Sergeant Petrov, emerged from beneath the engine, cowling with grease-stained coveralls and a concerned expression. The mechanic's tools clinked against each other as he wiped his hands clean, the sound echoing off the concrete floor of the maintenance bay. The intelligence briefing had been stark in its implications. Japanese forces in Manchuria were regrouping near Harbin, concentrating their remaining aerial assets for what appeared to be a desperate defensive operation. Colonel Marchenko's voice had carried the weight of recent losses as he outlined their mission parameters. The 9th Guards Fighter Aviation Regiment would provide escort for bomber formations targeting enemy supply lines, but reconnaissance suggested significant Japanese fighter resistance. Voronkov adjusted his leather helmet, the familiar weight of it settling against his skull. Through the hangar doors, he could see other pilots conducting their pre-flight rituals. Captain Dmitry Kozlov stood beside his own Yak-9, methodically checking control surfaces with the precision of a man who had survived 43 combat missions. The captain's movements betrayed no nervousness, only the calculated efficiency of experience. The smell of cordite from the firing range mixed with engine oil and the sharp scent of winter air. Voronkov's breath formed small clouds as he spoke with Petrov about fuel mixture settings and ammunition loads. The Yak-9U carried 120 rounds for its 20mm Schwack cannon and 340 rounds for the synchronized 12.7mm UBS machine gun. Each cartridge represented a chance for survival in the aerial battles that had become increasingly fierce as Japanese pilots grew more desperate. A radio crackled to life in the operations tent, its static-filled transmission announcing the departure of the Il-2 ground attack aircraft. The bomber formation would need fighter protection for the next 2 hours as they struck railroad junctions and fuel depots 60 kilometers northeast of their current position. Weather conditions remained marginal, with broken clouds at 3,000 meters and visibility limited by intermittent snow squalls. Voronkov climbed into his cockpit, the confined space embracing him like a familiar sanctuary. His hands moved automatically across the instrument panel, checking oil pressure, fuel gauges, and radio frequencies. The Klimov VK-107A engine turned over with a deep, mechanical growl that vibrated through the airframe. Blue exhaust flames danced from the engine stacks as the power plant settled into its operational rhythm. Kozlov's aircraft began taxiing toward the runway, followed by the other fighters of their formation. The weight of responsibility pressed against Voronkov's shoulders as he considered the intelligence reports about improved Japanese fighter tactics. Enemy pilots had begun using coordinated attacks, exploiting the superior climb rate and maneuverability of their aircraft against Soviet fighters. Recent encounters had cost the regiment 3 experienced pilots, losses that could not be easily replaced. The runway stretched ahead, its surface cleared of snow but still treacherous with patches of ice. Control tower personnel watched from their elevated position as the fighter formation prepared for takeoff. Red flares arced across the gray sky, signaling all clear for departure. Voronkov pushed his throttle forward, feeling the Yak-9U surge down the runway with increasing velocity. Airborne, the aircraft climbed steadily through layers of cloud, ice crystals forming briefly on the canopy before sublimating in the slipstream. Below, the Manchurian landscape spread out in white and brown patches, rivers frozen solid and roads barely visible under snow cover. The Il-2 formation appeared as dark specks against the horizon, maintaining their assigned altitude and heading toward the target area. Radio chatter remained minimal as the fighter escorts took up their protective positions. Voronkov scanned the sky continuously, his trained eye searching for the telltale glint of sunlight on enemy aircraft. The Yak-9U's cockpit provided excellent visibility, but Japanese fighters were known for their ability to approach undetected, using cloud cover and terrain masking to achieve tactical surprise. At 4,500 meters altitude, flying northeast at 420 kilometers per hour, the formation encountered its first indication of enemy presence. Kozlov's voice came through the radio with controlled urgency, reporting unidentified aircraft approaching from the east. Voronkov adjusted his oxygen mask and tightened his harness, the familiar pre-combat routine that had become second nature after 18 months of combat operations. The Japanese fighters appeared suddenly, climbing out of a cloud bank with the aggressive intent of interceptors who knew their homeland's survival depended on their success. Ki-84 Hayate fighters, their distinctive radial engines and streamlined fuselages immediately recognizable to the Soviet pilots. The enemy formation numbered at least 8 aircraft, positioning themselves for a coordinated attack on the bomber formation. Voronkov's training took over as he prepared to engage, his hand steady on the control stick while his thumb found the firing button. The Yak-9U responded to his inputs with the precise handling characteristics that had made it effective against Japanese opposition. Engine temperatures remained within normal parameters as he prepared to push the aircraft to its performance limits. The mechanical whine of supercharger gears served as a constant reminder of the technological evolution that had brought them to this moment over Manchurian skies, where the outcome of aerial combat would influence the broader strategic situation on the ground. The roar of Nakajima engines split the morning air over Manchurian territory as Captain Hiroshi Yamamoto adjusted his flight harness inside the Zero's cramped cockpit. Ice crystals formed on the canopy glass despite the early September warmth, 1945 bringing an unexpected chill that seemed to seep through metal and bone alike. Below, the endless expanse of grasslands stretched toward distant Soviet positions, marked by thin columns of smoke rising from abandoned settlements. Subscribe to discover the untold stories of aerial warfare that changed history forever. Yamamoto's squadron had been scrambling daily reconnaissance flights since the Soviet declaration of war 2 weeks prior. The metallic taste of altitude filled his mouth as he climbed through 8,000 feet. Scanning the horizon for movement. His wingmen maintained tight formation, their aircraft's shadows dancing across the terrain like dark omens. The radio crackled with static-laden reports from ground observation posts. Soviet armor had been spotted moving southeast through the Hingan Mountains, but intelligence remained fragmented and contradictory. Yamamoto pressed his leather gloves against the control stick, feeling the familiar vibration of his aircraft cutting through thin air. At 15,000 feet, something caught his peripheral vision, a glint of metal reflecting sunlight from the northwest. He squinted through his goggles, trying to identify the distant shapes emerging from cloud cover. The objects moved with purpose and speed, their silhouettes unfamiliar against the pale sky. "Unknown aircraft bearing 320, he transmitted to his flight. His voice carried the practiced calm of a veteran pilot, though uncertainty gnawed at his concentration. These weren't the lumbering Soviet bombers they had encountered before. The approaching aircraft resolved into sleek fighters with distinctive nose profiles and swept wings. Yamamoto had studied recognition charts extensively, but these machines defied easy categorization. Their paint schemes bore red stars, confirming Soviet origin, yet their design suggested capabilities that intelligence briefings had never mentioned. As the distance closed, Yamamoto noticed the lead aircraft's smooth lines and powerful engine cowling. The metallic gleam of propeller blades caught sunlight with each revolution, creating a hypnotic strobe effect that seemed to pulse with mechanical rhythm. This same metallic flash would haunt his memories in coming days, a herald of technological surprise that would reshape his understanding of aerial warfare. The Soviet fighters moved with predatory grace, their formation tight and disciplined. Yamamoto's training kicked in as he evaluated their approach vector and speed. These pilots displayed confidence that suggested extensive combat experience. their aircraft responding to control inputs with precision that spoke of advanced engineering. "Prepare for engagement," he ordered his squadron, though doubt crept into his calculations. The approaching fighters climbed effortlessly, their engines producing a distinctive whine that carried across the thin air. Yamamoto had never heard that particular sound before. A mechanical song that spoke of power and sophistication. Lieutenant Sato's voice crackled through the radio from the trailing position. Intelligence reports had mentioned new Soviet aircraft entering service, but specifics remained classified or unavailable to frontline units. Yamamoto found himself studying his opponents with growing respect and apprehension. The lead Soviet fighter began a climbing turn that revealed its true capabilities. Instead of the sluggish maneuvers Yamamoto expected from typical Soviet designs, this aircraft pulled through the vertical with authority that matched or exceeded his own Zero's performance. The pilot executed a barrel roll that demonstrated complete mastery of his machine's handling characteristics. Yamamoto's tactical mind processed the implications rapidly. If these new fighters possessed the speed and maneuverability they appeared to demonstrate, Japanese air superiority over Manchuria had become questionable overnight. The metallic flash of their propellers now seemed less like decoration and more like the gleaming edge of a blade. The Soviet formation split with practiced efficiency, individual aircraft taking positions that maximized their advantages while minimizing exposure to counterattack. Yamamoto recognized the maneuver from his own training, a standard defensive spread that allowed mutual support while maintaining offensive capability. As engagement range approached, details became clearer through his canopy. The Soviet fighters featured heavy armament installations and robust construction that suggested they could absorb significant battle damage while maintaining combat effectiveness. Their pilots flew with the confidence of men who trusted their equipment completely. Yamamoto's squadron found themselves facing opponents who had clearly studied Japanese tactics and developed countermeasures accordingly. The Soviet fighters used altitude and speed advantages to dictate engagement terms, forcing defensive reactions rather than allowing offensive initiative. The metallic gleam that had first caught his attention now filled his forward vision as the lead Soviet fighter closed distance with alarming speed. Its engine note changed pitch as the pilot adjusted power settings, the sound carrying overtones of mechanical precision that spoke of advanced manufacturing capabilities. In those crucial seconds before contact, Yamamoto realized that everything had changed over Manchurian skies. The comfortable assumptions of Japanese technological superiority had evaporated like morning mist, replaced by the harsh reality of facing adversaries who had learned, adapted, and evolved beyond recognition. Major Tanaka's fingers traced the edge of his flight manual as dawn painted the Manchurian sky in shades of copper and ash. February 14th, 1945. The temperature gauge read -18 degrees Celsius, and frost crystals had formed intricate patterns across the cockpit glass of his Nakajima Ki-84. Around him, 23 other Japanese pilots prepared their aircraft with methodical precision, their breath creating small clouds in the bitter air. The metallic screech of aircraft engines warming up echoed across Mukden Airfield. This sound had become his compass through months of escalating aerial encounters, yet today something felt different. Intelligence reports mentioned unusual Soviet aircraft movements near the border zones, but specifics remained frustratingly vague. Lieutenant Colonel Petrov adjusted his parachute straps inside the cockpit of his Yak-9U, the latest variant fresh from factory number 153 in Novosibirsk. The morning briefing had been clear. Reconnaissance flights reported significant Japanese air activity concentrating around strategic railway junctions. His squadron of 16 pilots represented the 303rd Fighter Aviation Division, recently equipped with these advanced machines capable of reaching 700 kilometers per hour at optimal altitude. Snow crunched beneath the boots of ground crews as they performed final equipment checks. The Yakovlev fighters bore distinctive winter camouflage patterns, white and gray schemes designed for the harsh Manchurian landscape. Petrov noticed how the morning light reflected off the polished aluminum surfaces, creating brief flashes that could be spotted from considerable distances. Tanaka lifted off at 6:47 hours, leading his formation in a wide sweep toward the disputed territories near Harbin. Below, the landscape stretched endlessly white, broken only by dark ribbons of frozen rivers and the occasional cluster of buildings sending thin columns of smoke into the frigid atmosphere. Radio chatter remained minimal, standard procedure when operating in contested airspace. The Japanese formation maintained cruising altitude at 4,500 meters, engines running smoothly despite the extreme cold. Tanaka had flown these routes dozens of times, memorizing every landmark, every potential ambush point. His aircraft carried full ammunition loads, two 20mm cannons and two 12.7mm machine guns. The weight distribution felt familiar, reassuring. Petrov's squadron approached from the northwest, using cloud cover to mask their approach. Soviet intelligence had provided detailed information about Japanese patrol patterns, allowing for calculated interception routes. The Yak-9U carried a single 20mm Schwack cannon firing through the propeller hub, supplemented by two synchronized 12.7mm Berezin machine guns. Maximum effective range 400 meters under ideal conditions. At 0712 hours, Tanaka's wingman spotted the first contrails. Initially dismissed as high-altitude weather phenomena, the trails showed too much organization, too much purpose. Tanaka banked slightly eastward, adjusting his formation's heading to investigate. Through his binoculars, he could make out aircraft silhouettes that didn't match any known Allied types operating in the theater. The metallic screech returned as both formations maneuvered for advantageous positions. Petrov recognized the distinctive profile of Ki-84 fighters from intelligence photographs, but seeing them in person revealed details no briefing could convey. The Japanese aircraft appeared larger than expected, their green and brown camouflage patterns clearly visible against the white landscape below. Tanaka felt his pulse quicken as the unknown aircraft resolved into clearer focus. These weren't the crude, bulky Soviet fighters described in intelligence reports. These machines appeared sleek, modern, with clean aerodynamic lines suggesting advanced engineering. The lead aircraft bore red star markings, confirming Soviet origin, but the performance characteristics seemed impossibly advanced. Both formations began a careful dance of positioning, each commander assessing the other's capabilities and intentions. Altitude became crucial. Whoever held the height advantage could dictate engagement terms. Tanaka climbed steadily, his formation following in tight formation, while Petrov's squadron spread into a wider attack pattern. The first engagement began at 0719 hours when Petrov dove from 6,000 meters, his Yak-9U accelerating rapidly. Tanaka barely had time to react as tracers streaked past his canopy, the distinctive green glow of Soviet ammunition clearly visible. He rolled hard left, pulling maximum G-forces, his vision beginning to tunnel from the strain. What shocked Tanaka most wasn't the Soviet pilot's aggression, that was expected, but the aircraft's performance. The Yak-9U matched his Ki-84's turn rate while maintaining superior energy retention. During vertical climbs, the Soviet fighter actually gained separation, defying every intelligence assessment he'd received about Russian aviation capabilities. Petrov found himself impressed by Japanese flying skills. These weren't the desperate, inexperienced pilots described in some Soviet reports. The Ki-84 formation maintained excellent discipline under fire, executing complex defensive maneuvers with precision that suggested extensive training and combat experience. The aerial combat evolved into a series of individual duels scattered across 30 square kilometers of airspace. Aircraft dove and climbed in intricate patterns, leaving vapor trails that dissipated slowly in the thin, cold air. Both sides discovered that their opponents possessed capabilities that challenged preconceived notions about enemy aviation technology and pilot training. Tanaka engaged a Yak-9U in a spiraling climb that tested both aircraft to their operational limits. At 7,200 meters, his opponent's engine began showing signs of strain, but not before demonstrating climb rates that exceeded Japanese intelligence estimates by significant margins. The Soviet pilot broke off the engagement with a half-roll that transitioned into a steep diving attack on another Japanese aircraft. By Aero 734 hours, both formations had sustained damage without achieving decisive results. 2 Japanese aircraft showed bullet holes and engine trouble, while one Yak-9U trailed coolant vapor from damaged radiators. The metallic screech of stressed engines and grinding metal had become a constant backdrop to the engagement. The turning point came when Petrov realized his ammunition was running critically low. His squadron had expended most of their cannon shells in the initial attack phases, leaving only machine gun rounds for continued engagement. Similar constraints affected the Japanese formation, forcing both commanders to consider withdrawal options. Tanaka made the first move toward disengagement, leading his formation into a climbing turn toward friendly territory. The damaged aircraft struggled to maintain formation speed, requiring escort protection that limited tactical options. Petrov's squadron shadowed them briefly before breaking off pursuit, unwilling to risk engagement over Japanese-controlled areas. As both formations separated, the immediate shock of the encounter began settling into strategic implications. Tanaka's radio reports would fundamentally alter Japanese assessments of Soviet aviation capabilities in the theater. The Yak-9U had demonstrated performance characteristics that challenged basic assumptions about Russian technological development. Petrov's post-mission analysis would similarly impact Soviet operational planning. Japanese pilot skills and aircraft performance had exceeded expectations in several key areas, suggesting that future engagements would require more sophisticated tactics and potentially larger force allocations. The metallic screech faded as engines cooled and aircraft landed at their respective bases. But that sound would return in the memories of pilots from both sides, marking the moment when assumptions about enemy capabilities shattered against the reality of modern aerial warfare. The metallic tang of aviation fuel mixed with the sharp bite of morning frost across Harbin airfield. Soviet Lieutenant Alexei Volkov adjusted his leather flight gloves, the familiar weight of his service pistol pressing against his hip as ground crews wheeled the Yak-9 fighters into position. December 15, 1944. The war machine of the Red Army had finally reached Manchuria's frozen heart. Subscribe to witness how history unfolded in these forgotten skies. Volkov traced his finger along the aircraft's aluminum skin, feeling the minute vibrations as the climb-off engine warmed. Frost crystals dissolved beneath his touch, leaving dark streaks on the camouflaged fuselage. Around him, 12 other Yak-9s stood in perfect formation, their propellers cutting lazy circles through air so cold it seemed to crack with each breath. The intelligence briefings had been clear. Japanese reconnaissance flights had increased over the Sungari River Valley. Their Nakajima Ki-43 Hayabusa fighters maintained regular patrols, testing Soviet airspace boundaries with mechanical precision. What the Japanese pilots didn't know was that Stalin had quietly repositioned 3 full fighter regiments to northern Manchuria, each squadron equipped with the latest Yak-9D variants. Captain Boris Petrov emerged from the operations tent, his boots crunching through yesterday's snow. Ice had formed overnight on his mustache, giving his weathered face an almost comical appearance. He carried the morning's flight orders in a leather portfolio, the red wax seal already broken. "Volkov, Mikhailov, Sergeyev," Petrov called out, his voice cutting through the engine noise. "Patrol Sector 7. Japanese formations spotted at dawn, bearing northeast." Volkov felt the familiar weight of combat preparation settle across his shoulders. His Yak-9's machine guns had been loaded with armor-piercing rounds. The ammunition belts fed through the wing roots with mechanical precision. The 37mm cannon mounted in the propeller hub contained 20 rounds of high-explosive shells, each one capable of destroying a fighter aircraft with a single direct hit. The engine oil had been preheated to prevent crystallization at altitude. Ground crews had scraped ice from the control surfaces using wooden paddles, careful not to damage the fabric-covered rudder and elevators. Every detail mattered when death waited at 20,000 feet. Volkov climbed into his cockpit, the leather seat cold despite the wool sheepskin lining. His hands moved through the pre-flight checklist with practiced efficiency. Fuel gauge, full. Oil pressure, normal. Magnetos, both functioning. The instrument panel glowed with pale green radium paint. Each dial and gauge positioned exactly where muscle memory expected to find it. The radio crackled with static as ground control established contact. Red flight. This is tower. Weather report. Visibility 15 kilometers. Winds northwest at 12 knots. Cloud ceiling at 4,000 meters. Japanese activity reported in grid reference Charlie 7. Volkov pressed the radio button with his thumb. Tower red leader. Understood. Requesting permission for takeoff. Red leader permission granted. Runway clear. The Klimov engine roared to full power, its 12 cylinders generating 1,400 horsepower through the three-bladed propeller. Volkov released the brakes and felt the Yak-9 surge forward, its narrow landing gear tracking straight down the packed snow runway. At 60 kilometers per hour, the control surfaces gained authority. At 90, the aircraft lifted cleanly into Manchuria's brittle winter sky. 12 minutes later, red flight climbed through 3,000 meters above the Sungari River. The landscape below stretched like a frozen map, with the dark ribbon of water cutting between snow-covered hills. Railroad tracks formed geometric lines across the terrain, connecting Harbin to the industrial centers further south. Smoke from factory chimneys rose in vertical columns before the wind dispersed it across the empty sky. Volkov's radio headset crackled with Lieutenant Mikhailov's voice. Red leader, contacts bearing 040, range approximately 8 kilometers. Count 4 aircraft, single-engine fighters. Volkov scanned the horizon through his gun sight. The morning sun created a glare against the snow, making aircraft identification difficult at distance. He adjusted his position to keep the sun at his back, using the tactical advantage of superior altitude and lighting conditions. The Japanese formation flew in perfect finger-4 configuration, their olive-drab Hayabusa fighters maintaining precise spacing. Each aircraft bore the distinctive red circular insignia of the Imperial Japanese Army Air Force, the rising sun symbol clearly visible on wing undersides. They appeared unaware of the Soviet fighters stalking them from above. Volkov studied his opponents through binoculars. The Hayabusa was lighter than his Yak-9, more maneuverable at low speeds, but the Soviet fighter held advantages in diving speed, climbing rate, and armament. The Japanese pilots were skilled, their formation discipline suggesting veteran units transferred from Pacific combat zones. Red 2, Red 3, follow my lead, Volkov transmitted. Attack from high side, maintain speed advantage, do not attempt turning combat. The Soviet fighters rolled into their attack dive, gravity and engine power combining to build devastating velocity. Volkov felt the aircraft's controls stiffen as airspeed increased past 400 kilometers per hour. The Hayabusa formation grew larger in his windscreen, individual details becoming visible on enemy aircraft. At 800 meters range, the Japanese pilots finally detected the diving Yaks. The lead Hayabusa broke, left in a steep climbing turn, his wingman following with mechanical precision. The second element scattered right, seeking to divide the Soviet attack and force individual combats. Volkov selected his target, the lead Japanese fighter climbing desperately to escape the diving attack. The Hayabusa's radial engine strained at maximum power, its propeller clawing for altitude that would never come. Volkov centered the aircraft in his gun sight and pressed the trigger. The 37mm cannon fired 3 rounds in rapid succession, each shell leaving a visible smoke trail. The first missed by meters, exploding harmlessly in empty sky. The second struck the Hayabusa's right wing root, severing control cables and fuel lines. The third round penetrated the engine compartment and detonated among the cylinder heads. The Japanese fighter rolled inverted and entered an uncontrolled spin, black smoke streaming from its shattered engine. Volkov watched the pilot struggle with his controls for 15 seconds before abandoning the aircraft. A white parachute blossomed against the winter landscape as the Hayabusa crashed into a snow-covered forest. Lieutenant Mikhailov engaged the second element, his machine guns stitching a line of holes across one Hayabusa's fuselage. The Japanese pilot attempted a desperate split-S maneuver but lacked sufficient altitude for recovery. His aircraft struck the frozen river at 300 kilometers per hour, creating a brief orange fireball that melted the surface ice. The remaining two Japanese fighters fled southeast toward their base, their pilots having learned a harsh lesson about Soviet air capabilities over Manchuria. Volkov circled the crash sites once before leading Red Flight home, the metallic tang of cordite still sharp in his nostrils. August 15th, 1945. The Manchurian sky bled orange as Emperor Hirohito's voice crackled through radio receivers across the continent. The war was over. Captain Yamamoto's hands rested motionless on his Zero's control stick, the engine's familiar vibration now feeling hollow against his chest. Below, the vast steppe stretched endlessly, dotted with burning Soviet tanks that had rolled through Japanese positions like steel tsunamis. The metallic taste of defeat coated his mouth as he banked south toward the airfield at Sinking. His squadron, what remained of it, followed in ragged formation. Of the 42 Zeros that had launched that morning, only 7 returned. The Yak-9s had carved through them with surgical precision, their pilots displaying a tactical awareness that had shattered every assumption Japanese command had held about Soviet aviation. Lieutenant Sato's Zero limped alongside, hydraulic fluid streaming from punctured lines like silver tears. The young pilot had managed 3 confirmed kills before a Yak-9's cannon shells had shredded his starboard wing. His radio transmission earlier had been clinical, matter-of-fact. Soviet fighters demonstrated superior climb rate, energy retention, and coordinated attack patterns that exceeded intelligence estimates by significant margins. The airfield materialized through the haze, its runways scarred by bomb craters and littered with the twisted remains of aircraft. Ground crews worked frantically to salvage what they could, loading trucks with spare parts and fuel drums. The Soviet advance had been so rapid that evacuation procedures, rehearsed countless times, now felt inadequate against the reality of mechanized warfare. Yamamoto touched down hard, his landing gear groaning under the stress of combat damage. As he taxied toward the dispersal area, he spotted Colonel Ishida standing beside the operations tent, his uniform pristine despite the chaos around him. The colonel's face bore the expression of a man who had spent decades preparing for this moment, yet remained utterly unprepared for its arrival. The debriefing lasted 47 minutes. Each pilot recounted their encounters with methodical precision, their voices steady despite the magnitude of what they described. The Yak-9s had operated with a level of coordination that suggested extensive combat experience. Their pilots understood energy management, vertical maneuvering, and deflection shooting with proficiency that bordered on artistry. Sato spread his flight charts across the wooden table, marking interception points and engagement zones with red ink. The Soviet fighters had appeared from multiple vectors simultaneously, suggesting radar guidance and ground-controlled intercept capabilities that Japanese intelligence had not anticipated. Their tactics emphasized teamwork over individual heroics, a fundamental shift from the dogfighting philosophy that had dominated Pacific theater combat. Colonel Ishida listened without interruption, occasionally making notes in his leather-bound journal. When the briefing concluded, he stood and walked to the tent's entrance, gazing northeast toward the advancing Soviet columns. The distant rumble of artillery had grown steadily louder throughout the afternoon, punctuated by the sharp crack of tank guns and the mechanical growl of diesel engines. Evacuation orders arrived at 1847 hours. Personnel were to destroy all sensitive materials and withdraw to secondary positions south of the Sungari River. The remaining aircraft would be flown to airfields in Korea, while ground equipment would be abandoned or destroyed to prevent Soviet capture. Yamamoto supervised the placement of demolition charges in his Zero's engine bay, each movement deliberate and ceremonial. The metallic taste returned as he inserted the final detonator. This machine had carried him through 18 months of combat, from the initial victories over Allied forces to the grinding attrition of the final campaigns. Its aluminum skin bore the scars of flak fragments and machine gun bullets, testament to battles fought across half the Pacific. As darkness settled over Manchuria, small groups of Japanese personnel moved south along secondary roads, their vehicles running without headlights to avoid Soviet air patrols. Yamamoto rode in the lead truck, his flight gear packed in a canvas bag beside him. The driver, a mechanic named Tanaka, navigated by memory and starlight, his hands steady on the steering wheel despite the exhaustion etched in his features. Behind them, orange flames illuminated the airfield as fuel dumps and ammunition stores exploded in sequence. The sound rolled across the steppe like thunder, marking the end of Japanese air operations in Manchuria. Soviet forces would occupy the base by morning, discovering the remains of an aviation infrastructure that had once projected power across thousands of miles of contested airspace. 3 days later, Yamamoto stood on the deck of a transport vessel in Busan Harbor, watching the Korean coastline recede into morning mist. The metallic taste had finally faded, replaced by something more complex, a mixture of relief and profound uncertainty about what lay ahead. The war that had defined his adult life was over, leaving behind questions that would require years to answer. His flight log, secured in a waterproof pouch, contained detailed observations about Soviet fighter tactics and capabilities. These notes would prove invaluable to Allied intelligence officers seeking to understand the emergence of a new aviation power on the world stage. The Yak-9s over Manchuria had announced the arrival of a Soviet Air Force transformed by 4 years of total war into something unprecedented in military aviation. The shock that Japanese pilots experienced during those final weeks was not merely tactical surprise, but the recognition that their assumptions about Soviet capabilities had been fundamentally flawed. The enemy they had expected to face, poorly trained pilots flying obsolete aircraft, had instead proven to be skilled professionals operating advanced fighters with tactical doctrines evolved through brutal combat experience on the Eastern Front. As the transport ship's engines settled into their steady rhythm, Yamamoto closed his eyes and listened to the sound of waves against the hull. The war was over, but its lessons would echo through decades of aviation development and military planning. The Yak-9s had done more than win air battles over Manchuria. They had demonstrated the transformation of Soviet military aviation from a secondary force into a primary instrument of national power.